Hey y'all, I'm James Wright and welcome to my shop. Today we are talking about resawing. So what is resawing? It is not cross-cutting, it's not ripping, but it is ripping the long way. So we're actually going to take this board and we're going to make it into two boards, cutting them a little bit thicker than 1/4 inch on either side by 6.5 inches wide. Now 6.5 inches wide isn't that big, and I've done it with these saws in this method up to 15 inches wide, which that is a lot of lumber to cut through and takes a long time. But with hand tools, how exactly do you do this? Let's dive in and take a look at some of the tools. So I've got this board. I want to make two boards out of this board, but I want them to be the same length and the same width, but a different thickness. And that is where a lot of fun comes in. Now, the easiest and simplest way for most people is just to grab a handsaw. This is a handsaw, not a panel saw. This is a panel saw, and you can see it's a good bit shorter, and the teeth on these tend to be a little smaller, whereas a handsaw tends to have fairly large teeth. This one is a 5 ppi with rip-cut teeth, fairly aggressive, and just a monster saw. It has a handle that is very beefy. You can see my hand is almost at 90 degrees to the teeth as opposed to being raked back. This way I can get my arm with more force behind it. Now that makes people think you need to put a lot of force into the saw, but you actually don't. You want to let the saw do the work even though your hand feels like it has a lot of force and a lot of control in it. Now when I first got started, I had a big handsaw and I did most of my resawing with this. It works very well, but it is kind of limited. The blade isn't that long and it's just a lot more work doing everything one-handed. Yes, you can put a second hand on there, but it's not quite as ergonomically designed. And that's why a lot of the old timers went to frame saws. This is a Resaw style frame saw. It has a 36-inch blade. This is a kit I got from Blackburn Toolworks. I'll leave a link to that down below, as well as I have a couple videos on making these. This makes resawing so much easier and so much more simple because it is far more ergonomic. You can get both hands into it. On this one, you can see I have pistol grips on here when I want to push, and when I want to pull, I have more traditional knobs on here to make it easier to pull back. I'll be talking through which one do you want to do on that. Do you want to push? Do you want to pull? And sometimes you might want to do different things. So if you have the time and money to make or buy a frame saw, this makes resawing a lot easier. Now they come in much larger lengths. They come in 48 inches. I found the 48 inch, I don't use the full length because the stroke of my body and arms just doesn't use that full 48 inches. I find 36 to be about perfect for me. But if you like the 48, then that is great for you. Another thing that a lot of them have is a taller plate. This one is 2 inches from teeth to back. Some of them come up to 4 inches wide, and a larger plate makes it so you have a little bit straighter cut, but it also means more friction on the cut and more work you have to put into it. I prefer about 2 inches. If you are learning how to saw, a larger plate might make it a little easier for you. It's a little easier to guide, but a smaller plate is far faster and easier to push, but it takes a little bit more skill. So for the sake of this demonstration, I'm going to be using the frame saw because I have it. And most people, if they're wanting to do some resawing, it's worth getting a frame saw. It saves you time, it's a lot more fun and more enjoyable. I will be showing some of the methodology used for a handsaw. It's basically the same idea, but a bigger and faster saw is always a little bit more fun. So first thing I want to do is tighten this down. I want this blade to be really, really tight. And a lot of people are afraid of really cranking it down. I'm going to do it as far as I can with my hand. I'm going to stick the screwdriver in there and I'm going to go 1, 2, maybe 2.5 full cranks all the way around until that's about where I want it. And that is going to give me a lot of force and control. And this is the time I'm going to eyeball down this saw. I want to make sure that there is no twist in the saw plate. Some people will even put it horizontally and put winding sticks on it to make sure that the saw plate is nice and straight. And if there is any in there, I can actually come back through here and twist it out. So the next thing I want to talk about is how to hold the work in place. I want my force to be running in line with my bench. I don't want to be sawing across the bench because it doesn't matter how sturdy your bench is, you're going to be putting a lot of force into this board. And if you're pushing across the bench, you're going to have enough leverage, you might be able to start tipping the bench. Some people like to use a leg vise and put it in there. And if you don't have a big end vise, putting it in the leg vise is nice, but because you're pushing across the vise, you may end up actually rotating the piece on the vise if you don't have an incredible amount of strength on that. So that's why I like to put it in the end vise here. It just makes it a little bit easier. The only problem is you want to make sure that you have enough space when you back up to actually run into it. You can see my light is here. I actually designed my bench so I have just barely enough space across the room to do it this way. Now when I mark out my line on the board, I put the pin in what looks about halfway across the board. And so I can run one line all the way down from one side. And then I'm going to flip this over, and I'm going to put the line from the other side as well. And this will actually give me two lines that are really close together. In this case, they're really close together. They're about 1 millimeter apart. And those two lines will give me a guide that I can put the blade right down the middle of those two lines. And if I want to split a board in half, rather than having one line where I'm staying right on the side of the line like normal, I find it easier just to follow a line right down the middle. Mark out exactly where the middle of the board is and then trace that line. So when I set this up, I'm going to set the saw right on the line, and I'm going to pick it up so that the heel of the saw is back here. I'm just working on the side away from me. And then I'm just going to give it one light push, and that starts the cut. And from this point on, the blade holds itself in place. So you'll hear it chattering a little bit. That chattering is because it's in a bench vise. This bench vise is actually flexing a little bit. And that is one of the big drawbacks to using an in vise as opposed to a leg vise. The leg vise doesn't flex that much because you're holding in it. But the work, if it's not held perfectly, will slowly rotate over time. Also, with the leg vise, you're moving beside the bench, and if you're not careful, you're going to be getting into the way of the bench, or your arm's going to be coming out of the way. Whereas having this, there's nothing between me and the bench. It makes it a little easier for me. Personal preference one way or the other. Now at this point, I want to talk about the force you put into the saw. It's very natural to want to really work into the saw and put your weight into it and drive this thing forward. You don't want to do that. You want to let the saw do the work. If you find yourself getting muscle sore, that means you're putting the work into this. You will get out of breath because you're doing cardio, but it shouldn't be something that's wearing you out muscularly. Because if you're putting force into it, you're going to be having a lot of issues. Over time, the saw may actually start to curve inside of the cut, and you'll take it apart and you'll have this like weird bowing shape. It's very painful. So once I have the saw curve developed, I'm going to lower the saw and start focusing on this line here. I'm not going to worry about the back side because I can turn it around and always look at one side, so I can follow the line on this side. And here you can see how I'm at an angle here. I'm following the line here, but I'm not really touching the line on this side. Once I get down a ways where it's no longer comfortable to go down, and my teeth are starting to touch the line on this side, then I can pull this out, rotate the board around, and make sure that I'm then following the line on the other side of the board. And then we can go to town on this side. So as you can see, I'm not putting a lot of force in the saw. I'm just letting the saw do it. My grip is very loose. You can almost have your fingers open. And some people find that their saw curve tends to wander when they push because they're still putting a lot of force into the blade. If that's something you have a problem with, you may find that pulling is a little bit easier for you. In this case, with this design, it's easier to flip it around, and these knobs are a lot easier to pull. The only problem with pulling is that the side that steers the saw is on the other side, so you can't see that as well. So it takes a little bit more force when you're pulling to steer the saw. But if it's set up right, you shouldn't have to worry about twisting it too much. But that being said, 99% of the time I prefer pushing, just a personal preference. I find it to give me a little bit more control and make it a little bit more stable in the cut. Now before I go much farther, I want to talk about the kerfing plane, or it used to be known as a rabbet plane, but Tom Fidgen designed this more for creating a kerf that goes all the way around the board, and theoretically that holds the saw in place. And when I first got into it, I really liked doing that. It did make making these lines a little bit straighter that much easier. You can see how there's just a saw in here, and you can set that to the right spot and create a kerf that goes all the way around the board. I don't do that anymore because I find it's just one more step and it takes more time for me to do this than it does. But I've gotten good at cutting that straight line with the saw. I don't need this as much to hold the saw in line with it. If you want to see a video on this, I do have a video on making the kerfing plane. It's a little older, but this was a very useful thing when I first got into resawing. This does make it a little bit easier to hold the saw in that kerf. But I don't use it anymore because I don't need to. So if all you have is a handsaw, the same rules apply. You don't want to force the saw. Here you can see how the saw is just sliding all the way through, and I'm letting the saw do the work, letting the weight of the saw carry it down. If I'm really forcing the saw, you'll often see it stop, like here, and kind of wedge itself because you're actually driving the teeth down into the wood. It'll look like something like that. And you're not getting a full stroke with it. You're causing the teeth to bite in, and that's actually going to cause it to veer inside of the cut. But the same rules apply in that you want to cut down on an angle. You want to follow the line on your side, and then once you're down at a good angle, pull the saw out, rotate the board around, and then that way you're following the line on your side of the board. You can always keep an eye on it. Hey, there we go. Let's see what this looks like. So there you go. We've taken one board and we've turned it into two. And now we can butterfly these together and make a panel for the bed that I'm working on, which if you want to see that, I'll leave a link to that whole build down below. But this is a project that takes a while to resaw by hand, but it can be done. And it is a great way to learn how to run a saw well. Because if you've done enough of these, you will be able to run a saw and follow a line beautifully. And then over time, you'll be left with a cut that looks like that. You're never going to expect this to be perfectly fine because you're using a fairly rough saw. So there's going to be a little bit of movement, but the inside should be pretty good. After a few dozen passes, we'll be able to get this nice and smooth. So this is ready for glue up and to turn it into a nice panel. So there you have it. Resawing doesn't have to be one of those things that is so challenging that you really can't do. If you have the proper tools, having a good, sharp frame saw is fantastic. And if you don't have a frame saw, then you can always grab a handsaw. It might be a little bit slower and a little less ergonomic as you're just using the one hand or trying to twist with the second hand, but it can be done. And I've done quite a bit of resawing with this very saw. And once you get a frame saw, it's just a lot more efficient and enjoyable. So I hope you like this. If you did, please hit like, comment, and subscribe. I'd love to hear your thoughts down below, and sharing really does help the channel out. So I think that's about it for now. And until next time, have a magical day. I tell you guys what, if you go back and watch this video over again, you get to resaw the video.